Well, it's great to have Robert Smith, General Secretary of the Boxing Board of Control from the offices in Cardiff, here with me now. As I call him, the British Roberto Duran, looking younger and younger every year. I see he's had a haircut for the occasion. Rob, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad at all, thank you. It's been a busy year in many ways, and I'm kind of looking forward to a little bit of a break. Got going to Bournemouth at the weekend. Got a good British title fight on there, an intriguing British title fight with Dan and Rocky, and hopefully Chris gets another win and he gets a world title shot next year. So it's looking good.
So you're talking of Chris Billham-Smith there, and
sorry, Chris Billham-Smith, Dan Aziz, and Rocky Fielding. So
and who are all great servants of British boxing. I mean, Dan Aziz is a fantastic story. Rocky's been around forever, it seems like. He's probably still only in his late 20s.
I think he possibly, it's certainly early 30s. He's not that old.
Exactly.
Makes me feel very old, but there you are.
Well, I think we're all feeling very old. It's a kind of year that has made us feel a little old as well. 2023, actually, which we'll come to later, promises so much. 2022 did as well, because we thought, Robert, that we would get Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua again. We were teased again.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any prospect of that happening in 2023?
Well, all I can do is hope so. Certainly, Tyson's got to get past Usyk yet, and hope that I do hope that's the next one, because obviously Tyson is a very good talent, but he hasn't met anybody as tricky as Usyk. And although I think the problem is that Tyson's at 6'9" is a difficult man to get to, and he's very nimble on his feet for such a big man. But I don't think he's met anybody as tricky as Usyk. He'll be moving around, etc. So I think for a period of time, that's going to be very interesting. I do think that over the course, you'd expect Tyson to get to him, but you never know. I mean, Usyk is one tough man, been brought up very tough, and obviously been through some very tough times recently, and I don't think he is bothered by the antics that come around in these fights. He just gets on with the job. Claims he doesn't speak much English. I believe he speaks better English than he puts across, and he does understand things, but he's got a good team around him. So that'll be very interesting. I possibly favour Tyson just because of his size, but it will be very interesting.
Let's talk about Tyson this year then, because he's probably our biggest star at the moment, isn't he, in sports? There's comparisons. Wayne Rooney called for him to be knighted the other night at Spurs. Frank Warren's compared him to perhaps our biggest sports star since David Beckham, which is a fantastic analogy or comparison in some ways. Bob Arum says he reminds him in his antics and the way he is with people, and become the people's champion, rather like Muhammad Ali. These are all comparisons that are being made by his promoters, of course, and they would say that. But 2 fights this year, both in Britain, 150,000 fans in 2 stadiums, 2 of our biggest stadiums. I mean, I cannot remember in my time, just over 30 years of covering boxing, or even talk ever historically of winter fights in an outdoor stadium where 60,000 people will come. I mean, it really does show the impact and popularity of the man, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and he's a great character. He's obviously had some tough times. He's turned things around as well. At one point, he wasn't particularly thought of highly, but now he is. That takes a lot of character. So he's obviously got that. And the other thing with regard to going to Wembley in December, Spurs in December, that's a huge of a brave decision by the promoter.
Yeah,
that could have been a complete washout. But it wasn't. I know it was very cold, but the weather was kind to them. They got away with it. But it was to get 60,000 people or 50,000 people or whatever there, and 90,000 people before is a hell of an achievement. And obviously, he's turned the corner. People like him. He has great ability. He talks as he sells fights. ultimately, and he's getting what he deserves.
He's an entertainer, isn't he? That's the thing. He's become an entertainer. In fact, I reminded him at the post-fight press conference that he hadn't sung. He forgot to sing. He was so overwhelmed. He was also concerned for Derek Chisora's welfare as well on the night, which was very touching. Did you feel that Derek's corner should have pulled him out a couple of rounds earlier and we wouldn't have had all this nonsense afterwards?
Well, I know Don very well, and I thought the referee was in a very hard place, because I think, there comes a point in the contest, I believe, where I know Derek well. I get on well with Derek. We've obviously had our ups and downs, but we get on well now.
We've had a lot of ups and downs. So he's one of the most punished.
Quite a few, but he's a character.
He is. He's become cult status, hasn't he?
Yeah, but I think at some point there was nothing there that he could have turned the fight around with, I don't believe. But of course, it's a world heavyweight championship. You want to give them as much opportunity as you can. But if they'd have pulled him out a round or so earlier, there'd have been no complaints from me.
Yeah. Lots of people talking to me on all the platforms I work on about Derek shouldn't be going on. He shouldn't be taking too much punishment, that he's 39 next year. What can the board do? Or do you have an attitude about fighters that are going on too long?
Yes, we do. The trouble you've got, Gareth, is that if they pass all the medicals, which obviously he has, he's boxing at very high class. On the whole, other than the last time, he's been putting up good, although he's lost a few, but he's been put up good competitive contests. It's very difficult to do that. And I would not wish any medical condition on anybody in this sport, obviously. But the medicals are very strict. And if there is a reason that we believe somebody should not be boxing, then obviously we will stop them from boxing. But if you keep passing the medicals, and I'm sure that in the future I'll speak to Derek myself. He has a family. He's had a great career if you consider how long he's been going, and the quality of people he's boxed. Hasn't always won, but the quality's been very high. There does come a point and I'll still call him a young man because he's young compared to me, where you need to look at your circumstances at home, which is a little bit more important than boxing, I think. Yeah. And I think he's come to that.
And just looking at the heavyweight division as a whole right now, can you remember a better time? If I can run through them, we've got, or maybe you can run through them, you'll know that, that we've got probably, we could argue, maybe 5 or 6 of the top 10 heavyweights in the world from Britain right now.
Yeah, I'd say we have. Joe Joyce is there, Daniel's there, a bit of a rocky night of the night, but he's still there. Obviously, Anthony's there. Tyson's there. It's looking good.
Dillian
White's still there. So I think it's looking good. And they're all competitive fights. People may say, well, it's not like the days of Ali and Frazier, etc. And I would possibly agree with that. But then again, I was a young man watching those fights, and you always build things up higher when you were younger, and because that's what took you to the sport. But they are all very, very competitive fights. And to be honest with you, I think Tyson has admitted this. Anybody can win one punch to the chin, and it's all over. So anybody can win them. You could box each other 10 times and have different results each time. So no, very competitive, and contests, I believe people want to go and see.
And also, it's encouraging those younger fighters like Fabio Wardley, David Adeleye. I'm missing someone out here. Johnny Fisher and all these guys coming through, and it's encouraging them as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and also don't forget Fraser Clark.
And Fraser Clark.
He obviously just turned over. He has huge amount of amateur experience, and you could argue he's been a pro for many years because of the sort of tournaments he's been in, etc. So I wouldn't have thought they'd hold him back too much.
But when you look at it at the moment, if you've got Fury, AJ, Joyce, Daniel Dubois, Dillian White, Derek Chisora, then Wardley, Adeleye, Fisher, Clark, not bad. That's not a bad 10 British heavyweights, is it?
And the good thing is, there's people, the ones you've just mentioned are coming up behind the others.
Yeah.
So, that's the one thing that people always say, well, it's never going to be the same. But you and I have discussed it before. In the 70s, time I really remember, Dave Green, Minter, John Conti, etc. They all thought, what's going to happen after that? And then the next lot come along, and then the 80s, Eubank, Benn, and Collins, and then another lot comes along, and Ricky and Joe came along. So it's always a conveyor belt of people. You may have a couple of years where it slows down a little bit for them to mature, etc., and to work the pro game out. But I'm fairly confident that we have. And the one thing that is very advantageous now that we never had, certainly when I was boxing amateur, and let's just hope boxing stays in the Olympics, but the GB squad. I mean, ultimately, Robert McCracken and his team have revolutionised the amateur game with regard to the high level. I know the amateur clubs are still struggling, like we all are. Our vast majority of our promoters, 80% of them struggle. We know that. And that's the same with the amateurs. But the top level is very, very good. And we've been successful in the Olympics, gradually built that up. And obviously, they are more pro-orientated now, the amateurs, than they ever were before. And that helps with their pro careers.
But we've never had a time when our heavyweight division's so strong that it's not so much about fights in America now. It appears that fighters from other countries want to come here to fight now.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That's a shift, isn't it? That's a very good shift, a very welcome shift, I imagine, from your perspective.
Absolutely. I mean, we're getting the stadium fights. America, you tell me the last time there was a major stadium fight in America.
Well, only Canelo.
Canelo's the only one.
And he's not even American, so yeah.
No, he's not American. But Wilder never sells out stadium in America, but he'd sell out stadium in Britain.
He would.
Every box, yeah.
If Wilder came here and had 5 fights, he could probably have 5 stadium fights with those 5 British boxers.
Absolutely. I mean, the one thing that I do believe is we do have the best fans in the world. Ultimately, we're an island, we're a fighting nation, generally, and boxing is steeped in British culture. And football is God, and we have to accept football is God. But following behind that is rugby, cricket, and boxing, I believe. And we've always had, for such a small country, the population is relatively big compared to others, but we've always had great success in all the divisions ultimately. So I think it looks good, and people, as you said, people want to come here, and as long as we can keep the quality going, which I believe we can, then they will come here.
On the Olympics, you touched on that. It's one of the subjects I wanted to ask you about. Obviously, 2024 is the year after next, but and there is amateur boxing in the Olympics. The fact it's been excluded from the list of sports in 2028 in Los Angeles, that's a huge concern, isn't it? Because the funding rounds and the funding route for the English Institute of Sport, where the teams are based, as you say, under Rob McCracken, there's millions and millions of pounds of funding that comes through Olympic medals that we've won. Without having our Olympians winning medals, you would wonder whether that exchequer funding will then not come to that group and to the sport itself, the lifeblood, with Alexander Usyk and so many others that you can name now who are gold medalists from the games. Joshua, Lennox Lewis, Frazier, Ali, Foreman, all these guys were heavyweight and light heavyweight champions.
Yeah, I think it would be a disaster.
Yeah,
personally. An absolute disaster for the sport, certainly for the amateur sport. You'd possibly get boys and girls turning pro earlier than they are now, and I think I'm a big believer in not turning pro too young if you can get the backing, if you can get the experience of an amateur. When I turned pro at 18, in hindsight, it was too early. I was only a boy, fighting men. So I think that's a big concern I would have. But of course, it is a worldwide sport, and to be left out of the major sporting arena in every 4-year cycle would be terrible. And then would that affect the Commonwealth, and would that affect the Worlds, and would that affect the Europeans, etc.? I don't know. That proof will be in the pudding. But no, I think somebody's got to sort the amateurs out with regard to their high echelons of whatever, and get it rectified ultimately.
What can you do in terms of, I mean, I spoke to Mauricio Sulaiman about this last week at a lunch, and he said, we all have to campaign. Broadcasters, media, sanctioning bodies, commissions, boxing boards of control. We should all be writing to the IOC and trying to persuade Mr. Kremlev and others to really bow down and just follow the strictures and instructions and get it over the line.
Yeah, get it over the line is the most important thing. I talk to a lot of MPs, etc., about the state of British boxing. We also have a circle. I communicate with the chief executives of the amateur codes here. So we're all talking, you know, and doing things, dealing with white collar boxing, dealing with other things within the sport, etc. So, you know, yeah, that's the way to do it. Just put pressure on them. Whether anybody takes any notice of everything altogether, that's what you would hope they would.
There's a few other subjects I'd like to ask you about.
Yeah.
Two of the controversies of the year: the judging in Jack Catchell, and Josh Taylor early in the year, and the Conor Benn Chris Eubank fight. Can we just start with the judging first of all? I know that one of your judges was reprimanded over the Catchell Taylor and suspended for a short period of time. Are you happy with judging in general? And what is it that causes so many people to be unhappy with so many of the decisions that are being made at the moment?
I think on the whole, with the amount of bouts we have, not just shows, but bouts, the judging is okay. There are some occasions where you think don't get them. On the Catchell fight, I've been quite open. I thought Jack nicked it by 2 rounds, but it was a scrappy fight, and Josh was doing the pushing. And to be honest, I don't think anybody thought Jack was going to put on such a great performance that he did. I think it took people by surprise, not the judges, etc. Also, I do think that the media and the TV have a huge influence on the people watching it at home, and that's understandable. And I've got no problem with that. But I think sometimes you've been to contests, or we've watched a fight, and I thought, well, you know, Gareth nicked that, you know, simple as that. But when you go home and watch on television, it's a different fight altogether.
Yeah.
And I do think there's a little bit of that. But I think on the whole, the judging is good. I mean, I was at the Josh Warrington fight the weekend, and it was very close. But I have to say, I didn't score the contest properly at ringside. I was working a couple of rows back. But I thought Josh just about lost it. But if it had been a draw or 1 round his way, I don't think you could have argued.
Yeah.
He was just boxing a very awkward, good fighter.
Yeah, but in terms of for Catchell, for example, that universally people thought he won that night. And yes, great champions get in the minds of people. They're human. It's a subjective process, and I think the arguments that have been put forward that have gone is that, you know, Josh Taylor was seen as number 5 pound for pound in the world with the Ring magazine at the time and the Ring ratings, and you see him as being the winner. He was a big favourite. But what can we do when a guy that's probably one of the biggest, if you're calling it robberies we've seen for a long time. People use that word. What can you do practically as a commission, as a board, to say, right, that's wrong, we need to put that right?
Well, I think, you know, we have obviously we can't control the training of overseas officials coming over here generally, but we can ours. And I know there are all 3 British officials on that night. They all had to explain how they got to that decision, all of them. And they explained it, and they gave their reasons. And the reasons generally were, well, it was a scrappy fight. And Josh was trying to push the fight all the time, and they went for the aggression. It is very subjective, and people would, you know, bite my head off for saying that it's subjective, but it is subjective.
Yeah.
And you know, we have a very long training process in this country. People will say it obviously doesn't work. I believe it does. It can take you 10, 15 years to become a star class referee, at which point you can judge world title fights, etc. And I think on the whole, we get it right. Of course, there's always the odd occasion where people will criticise and don't agree with it. You know, as I say, just go back at the weekend. I thought that it was a very close fight, could have gone either way, but it didn't. Doesn't mean it was wrong. And I don't know whether, you know, I've seen some comments about people thinking that Josh won it. Other people thought Lopez won it. You know, if it's like that, it's very, very difficult. And I also think if there's 2 rounds difference in a fight, that's tough because any fight can go either way. Yeah. And you know, I think the thing that is frustrating is possibly the scoring system. If you win a round big, it's still 10-9. If you just nick it, it's still 10-9.
Yeah.
And try to get the judges to. I mean, we had a score at the weekend with Ebony Bridges. She didn't knock the person down, but she got the round 10-8 because she won the round so big. So if we could get people thinking like that if it's a big round, you make it 10-8. And then you try to get that worldwide. You know, I've been to some conventions, WBC, WBA, WBO, IBF, and they have a room of judges and they look at fights, etc. And it's very difficult to get a total consensus of what they're looking for because it's subjective. Now that's not going to please everybody, but that's a fact. And we do try our very best to get it right all the time, as you'd expect. Some people would disagree with many decisions.
2 more things to talk about, or 3 more things to talk about on this catch-up of the year, and we'll come to it in a minute. Really, coming up, we're going to look at the growth of fights in the Middle East. I'd love to get your take on that. The Conor Benn, Chris Eubank situation as it emerged, and also how women's boxing grew in 2022 in an inordinate way. Coming up next. Robert, part 2 of this, we've just recorded again. The Conor Benn, Chris Eubank situation is a very unusual situation. The fight not called off after the board had called it off for 30 odd hours. What do we make of that looking back? Obviously, you can't talk about the case still. It's still under, you know, kind of sub judice, if you like. What do you make of that case? Were mistakes made on different sides over it?
I think it was an unusual case. I've never dealt with anything so complex, I don't presume, with regard to anti-doping. I think with regard to the fight not being pulled after the board already said we're not going to sanction it, we'd have to ask the people involved on that. You know, my feeling was it was disappointing. We were as quickly as we could get it done, and we did. But other than that, there's not a lot more I can say. Ultimately, the lawyers are dealing with it, and it's very, you know, I'd love to, and at some point we'll be able to when it's all resolved and whatever, and the reasons why things were done and what has been done. But at the present time, unfortunately, and I do mean it, it's unfortunately, nothing more can be said from my side.
And we're not close to it being resolved before Christmas, that kind of thing then at the moment.
I think this is, you know, I know the sanction body is looking at it, but ultimately it's the licensing of boxers that's very important as well. So it's twofold things, but other than that, there's not much more I can say, Gareth. I do apologise. I do know it's your job to push me, but on this occasion, I've been dealing with lawyers on, well, I deal with lawyers on a lot of things at the moment, to be honest with you, but you know, I've been instructed you can't say anything more than you've already said.
A quick one on more and more fights happening in the Middle East and some very big ones. Is it of any concern that more fights are heading to the Middle East rather than to America now?
No, I don't think so. You know, this is a short sport for individuals, and I certainly believe they should make as much money as they possibly can, as safe as they possibly can. I was always told by my father, who was a boxing manager and trainer, that boxer's career is like a big oil tanker. You come into port empty, you fill up and you get out. And I think that's what boxing should be. You know, it's not a long-term career. And I think that if you can make as much money as you possibly can, then you should. Obviously, you know, we may lose some big fights, but we may gain some as well. America, slightly different. You know, it's like the heavyweight division. There's not many big Americans anymore. They either go into basketball or American football because maybe it's more lucrative for them over there. But that's always been the case. A lot of people have done that. But no, if it goes to the Middle East, then, you know, if we haven't got the money here, then they have to go where they can.
Women's boxing, huge growth in 2022 and some amazing events.
Absolutely. And the strength in the divisions is getting more and more. I mean, I do think at the present time, you know, you have the top boxers, then there's a bit of a gap, and then you have the other boxers, etc. But that gap is getting smaller. And again, the training of the amateurs in this country has been very beneficial to them. So I can see in a couple of years' time it being maybe not quite as strong as the male side just yet, but he's certainly catching up. And there's some good fights. There really is some good fights out there to be made, and good British fights.
Marshall Shields, an amazing event, really.
Yes, yeah. I think the whole event went very well. You know, do you think there's a possibility it could be unusual just having all male shows? I don't know, because you know, that went very, very well. It was popular. I think TV had good figures, but it is a sport for both sexes, and you know, to have one show with just females is, you know, it's been new, but is it something we want all the time? Because I'd like it all mixed and matched, to be honest with you.
What more licenses for? I think there's 50 odd women got licensed.
Yeah, I think we're about 45, 50 now, but we've got quite a few. I've got a board meeting tomorrow to put a few more license applications through. We'll be about 55. We've only got another week to go, or 2 weeks to go. We'll be at 55, 60 by the time the end of the year.
And COVID,
they're not all active all the time. Obviously, you get a license, you have a fight, you have a bit of a break maybe. But certainly it is healthier than we've ever had it before.
And a final one, you know, obviously with COVID clear in 2022, more boxing shows than ever?
Yes. This year, from January to the end of December, 307. That's the most we've ever done.
How does that compare with other years then?
Well, the year before COVID, it was 270 something. Then obviously COVID hit and it was right down. But even then, when we got going, so we suspended in March the 17th, I think it was. And our first show back was the 10th of July. And we still had 120 shows. So it's a sport that's very, very popular, as you can imagine.
So it's growing.
307
is growing.
Sorry?
It's growing.
It's growing. Yeah, the sport's growing. I mean, the frustrating thing is, and we've talked about it before, is promoters running shows on the same night. That does affect audience. It does affect TV. But you know, there used to be a rule when I was very young where you couldn't run on the same night, but that got challenged. It got changed, and obviously it's ultimately up to the promoter. It's their choice. Just one thing, going back to female boxing, in Great Britain you can do 3-minute rounds. Nicola Adams did a 3-minute round. So to say that it's not allowed, it is allowed in Great Britain. Where the difference is the sanctioning bodies, and of course they're all world title fights or Commonwealth title fights or European title fights, and they're 2-minute rounds.
And finally, how are you looking forward to 2023 as a better year for boxing?
I am, very much so, very much so. I'm just looking forward to getting rid of this year. It's been a tough year, but it's been, I mean, you know, there has been things that's gone wrong. We know that, but on the whole, it's been a successful year. We've had some good fights, had some good publicity. We've got good TV shows. The small hall promoters, I hate the term, but the small hall promoters find it very difficult without TV, but there's this streaming service now. So there's more boxing in the media now than there has been for quite some time. Now, there might be the big shows, and we were talking about media, etc., and newspapers slowly dwindling, which is disappointing. But there are other avenues now where news gets out. Can be watered down a little bit, but boxing does relatively well.
Great to speak to you about the state of the union in boxing for the year, Robert. Thank you very much indeed.
No problem, Gareth, and have a good Christmas, have a good break. God bless you. Take care.
Thank you.